everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with the privacy engineering talk. Love the enthusiasm. That was sincere. There was a woot, so okay. My name's Ellen Nadeau. I work with the privacy engineering program at NIST, part of the Applied Cybersecurity Division. This is Paul Grassi, standards and tech lead for the Trusted Identities Group, who's going to be speaking after me. So the privacy engineering program at NIST kicked off about 3 years ago now, and just in January we released a publication, a NIST internal report, introducing concepts around privacy engineering and privacy risk management, working on developing guidance and tools in those areas to bring those discussions more into parity with how organizations are already talking about risk management and systems engineering from a security context. So that's what I'm going to talk more about today. At NIST, we talk quite a lot about trustworthy systems. How do you have trustworthy systems? This is not a new idea. We hear about trustworthiness a lot, and typically the inputs we hear about are security, reliability, and we think that privacy is also a really important attribute of trustworthy systems. The goal of trustworthiness is one of our goals in creating trustworthy systems is to innovate new technologies that are adopted. And so we think privacy is also a key part of getting individuals to actually adopt these systems because they trust that their information is protected. They know what's being done with it. So NIST's work in cybersecurity, safety, supply chain can all contribute to the idea of trustworthy systems and these other attributes, but there isn't as much guidance, there's not as many tools around how to do privacy, how to build it into your system, how to assess the risks and manage them, and so that's what we are working on. Developing those tools so we can talk about privacy the same way we do security and these other attributes. So we do get a lot of questions about how we differ between security and privacy, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the difference in overlap. We see security concerns as things that arise from unauthorized system behavior. So if you have an insider threat or an external bad actor that's making your system operate in a way that it shouldn't, then that's a security issue. And then we do have some overlap between security and privacy, and that's really when we're looking at data security, security of PII, confidentiality of individuals' information. But then when we're talking about privacy, our perspective is that privacy concerns arise from authorized processing of PII in a system. So let me give you an example of that. Smart meters collect a lot of information about individuals, right? What kind of electronics you're using at home, when you're using them. And so individuals have expressed a lot of concern about smart meters. Some communities have pushed back around smart meters. And the concerns aren't always focused on the security issues. What if there's a breach of the system? The concerns are really simply in the inherent idea that these systems are collecting this information in the first place. So not necessarily some bad actor coming in, but just the fact that the system is collecting this PII and aggregating it in a certain way. So that's what we call a privacy concern. And we really focus our conversations on what are the potential problems for individuals that processing PII in a system can lead to. So this is a non-exhaustive list of what some of those problems might be: loss of trust, discrimination. We base this off of Dan Solov's taxonomy of privacy. Again, it's a non-exhaustive list. Organizations doing privacy risk management might have other problems that they're interested in looking at. Maybe emotional distress is a problem we don't have listed on here that an organization might be interested in. So looking at this security risk model, we're looking at likelihood and impact of threats, vulnerabilities, and we really just don't think that this model does what we need to do for the privacy space. And it goes back to the Venn diagram, right? If we're looking at smart meters as creating privacy problems, what would the threat be in that situation if the concern is really about them collecting the information and what they're inherently doing with it on a day-to-day basis? You sort of have to identify that the whole system is the threat itself, right? Which is pretty useless when you're trying to identify privacy risks and prioritize them and figure out how to manage them. So we knew that we needed a different model that paralleled this one and was more focused on privacy-specific inputs. So this is what we came up with. We look at likelihood and impact of a data action, which is any action a system takes that's processing PII, everything from collection of that information all the way through to disposal. We're looking at the risk that this might become problematic for an individual. So we call that a problematic data action, if a data action becomes problematic for an individual. And we're looking at likelihood and impact of this happening. So likelihood is a contextual analysis that a data action creates a problem for a representative set of individuals. The context is really important there. We don't assign inherently any value to specific pieces of PII because, a system doing something with your phone number in one way and in one context might be totally different in a different context, have a very different likelihood of it becoming a problem or a different impact. So it's a deeply contextual analysis, likelihood. And then when we look at impact, this one's a little bit trickier. We found it to be a little bit trickier because it's difficult to assess what the impact would be to individuals when people experience these problems in all different ways. We encourage organizations to assess impact in whatever way makes most sense for them, but the way that we do it in our model so far is looking at the impact to the organization, actually. And I'll get into a little bit later what the different impact options are there. And then I just want to emphasize that the goal is not to mitigate all the risks, that it would be unreasonable. The goal is to identify what the risks are so you can make an informed decision about how to manage them. We see sometimes consent is overused. It transfers the risk to an individual, but doesn't mitigate it. But sometimes transferring the risk makes sense, right? So just a reminder that this is, there are a few different ways you can deal with risk once you've identified it. So we created a privacy risk assessment methodology, which was mentioned earlier this morning in the first talk. And we've been piloting it with organizations from private sector, public sector, state governments, healthcare organizations, working a lot with the Trusted Identities group at NIST, which Paul is part of, and the pilots that they have. The pilots, they comply with certain pillars, usability, security, privacy, and privacy we found was just a really tough one for them to not only comply with, but also to be able to demonstrate compliance, right? To be able to show we have privacy-enhancing systems and show what the risks were and show that they mitigated them, and these worksheets we found have just been really helpful in walking through that whole process. So it's a way to really operationalize the concepts I introduced earlier. So I'm going to walk through how we've been doing that. So the first worksheet, there are 4 worksheets. The first one starts out with framing the business objectives of the system. So we're looking at what's the functionality of your system, what are the business needs that your system serves, and if you're marketing your system in a way that relates to privacy-enhancing behavior, then what are you saying about it? And so this does a few different things. First of all, later on in the privacy risk management process, when you're choosing the controls you're going to use to mitigate certain risks, you want to be sure that you're not choosing controls that might hurt the functionality of your system, right? We want to make sure that we're maintaining the performance of your system. So we're setting that out up front. What is the functionality your system's serving? And also, if you're marketing your system, talking about privacy-enhancing technologies, then this process can help you build up evidence to support that and demonstrate that. So the next part of the first worksheet is framing privacy governance. So we're looking here at the legal environment, any principles you might be aligning with, like the Fair Information Practice principles. And this helps later on when we're assessing impact. One of the things we look at is non-compliance costs to an organization, so this is helpful to have up front. And then also we look at internal culture costs, so that could also be affected by what your legal environment is and what principles and mission statements you have that relate to privacy. So the next step is when we work with organizations is that they create a data map to show the system design and to clearly illustrate what the different data actions are in the system and what PII is associated with each. This is just a sample, not a real use case. And we encourage organizations to use whatever data maps they're most comfortable with. Organizations usually already are doing this. As long as it highlights clearly the data actions and the PII associated with each, that's the most important thing. So then we can use those data maps to then build out this worksheet where we're looking through the specific data actions, the PII associated with each, and then what is the specific context around it, and what are some summary issues. So context we look at in a couple of different ways. There's system context. well, there's overall context. So we look at system, organizational, and users. And then we also break it down by specific data actions. We're looking at specific context to that data action. So I'll give you an example. If a data action is about the transfer of data from one system to another, when we're looking at summary issues, like looking at the context, looking at the system, what questions might we have, what conclusions can we draw? So we might say, okay, we're transferring data from one system to another, so is an individual going to understand the governance and usage of those two systems, right? That might be a summary issue. Important things you want to note, and also, we work with organizations that are starting this really early in the process of system development, and so things might change, and that's okay. And this is a good way to capture some of the open questions you might have in summary issues. And we oftentimes here also get into a talk about boundaries, and the data actions that you're mapping here, is it going to stop with what's in your control in your system? Sometimes yes, but we've also found it beneficial to look a little bit outside of that. When you pass your data on to a third party, what's happening next? We found that can be helpful too. So maybe you might structure information a little bit differently when you send it to a third party, like maybe instead of sending somebody's date of birth, you just say, yep, they're over 21, right? Something like that if you find that there's a risk when you pass it on. Or maybe it's also adjusting how you're writing a contract that you have in place with a third party. So once we've spelled out the different data actions, context, summary issues, we're going to pull that into the next worksheet where we're actually starting to assess the privacy risk. And so we take a semi-quantitative approach where we assess likelihood and impact on a scale of 1 to 10, but it's really all about prioritizing the risks. So you can use whatever you're most familiar with. Maybe it's low, medium, high. We like 1 through 10 because at the end of the process, it provides a much more granular look of the different risks, and that helps with prioritization. But again, it's really just about prioritizing the risks. So I mentioned here that impact, we're focusing really on business impact. So some of the things we have here that we're assessing are non-compliance costs, direct business costs, reputational costs, and internal culture costs. And then, of course, there's space here if you want to add your own. So then ultimately, you end up with a heat map. People like pictures, right? We found that it's really useful in just communicating these risks across an organization, being able to concretely look at the privacy risks and talk about them in an organization the same way they're talking about security risks and financial risks, right? And just bringing that discussion up a level. So it definitely is a time investment. But we found it to be really helpful with the organizations we've worked with. One even used this heat map showing the risks to make the case for additional resources for their privacy team, because they said, hey, these are some risks we have to mitigate. We need some more people to do it. So that was really cool to see. And then the last step is once you see the risk, is determine which ones you want to mitigate and then how you're going to do that. What controls are you going to put in place? So this is our last worksheet where we're actually listing the potential controls, considerations about them, and then you're actually selecting controls, your rationale for that, and what's the residual risk? Because again, you're not going to mitigate risk 100%, right? So for the most part, there's going to be some residual risk, and this gives you an opportunity to note that. So another thing that we did in addition to creating these worksheets is we came up with 3 objectives, privacy engineering objectives that parallel the CIA objectives for security. So the idea here is that they're design characteristics of a system. So, they're not supposed to be telling you what privacy looks like in your system. They more support the policies you have. So, for example, in the security field, with availability, it doesn't necessarily dictate the time of availability of your system, because a 911 emergency system might be different than a different system. It just supports the policies that you have, right? So we're looking to do the same thing with privacy, and it also supports control mapping, and they're, like CIA, not supposed to be role-based. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So the first objective is predictability, and it's all about enabling reliable assumptions, again, not role-based, so by individuals, owners, and operators, about the PII and what's happening to it in a system. So if you were to go to a friend and say, this system is doing X, Y, and Z to your information, would they be surprised? If they'd be shocked, then maybe that's a non-reliable assumption and there's a risk point there, and that's where you'd want to implement some control to address that. And that might be providing additional notice so the user has a better understanding of what's going on, or maybe you're going to implement a cryptographic technique that aligns the system more with user expectations, all on the back end, but you say, okay, if the user thinks X is happening, let's make X happen. So different ways you can come at those. The second objective is manageability, which is all about providing the capability for alteration, deletion, and disclosure of PII. Again, not risk-based. It totally depends on not role-based. Totally depends on your organization who has this capability. If you have a CROD reporting system, you probably don't want an individual to be able to go in and change the information at will, right? But the point is that that capability exists in your system. And then the last one is disassociability, which is all about enabling the processing of PII or events without association to individuals or devices beyond what's required for actually operating the system. And we actually did use these in a use case that Paul's going to talk about a little bit later. So we get asked a lot, how does all this fit in with existing privacy principles, like the fair information practice principles you might be familiar with? And the answer is that we think all of those pieces are really important. These are all pieces of the puzzle. Risk management plays an important role in bringing some of these high-level principles into a more concrete practice for engineers to work with when designing a system. But all these pieces fit together, and so this is just our take on one way that they could fit together. So as we're developing additional guidance and tools, the document we released in January was really introductory concepts, and now we're looking to dig deeper. So this is a roadmap of documents we'd like to be working on in the next few years. A lot of these are risk management framework documents. So the first one that we're actually working on, 63, which Paul will talk about, and then also 853 is the Security and Privacy Controls Catalog, which is currently under revision. And so a couple drivers for that, in July 2016, OMB updated Circular A130 and said that federal agencies should actually be applying their NIST risk management framework to their privacy programs. So we're developing guidance around that. And also, just so happened that 53 was also under its typical FISMA revision. So we have been working on that and hope it'll be public very soon. I'm just going to go through briefly the changes we made to this. So before, if you're familiar at all with 853, the last version, privacy was tacked on as an appendix at the end, Appendix J, which was a really important first step in integrating privacy into the catalog. I'm actually not going to go there. It was a really important first step, but it sort of had privacy as more of an afterthought, and we wanted to integrate privacy more thoroughly throughout the catalog. So we did that a few different ways. We removed the appendix, and we added two specific privacy families, individual participation and privacy authorization. The other appendix, program management, they also actually pulled up into the main family, so they're all in one appendix now. And then we also integrated privacy throughout the controls, and I'll give you a couple examples. So for the new families, individual participation and privacy authorization, this is what those look like in their current state. You'll see a lot of the controls look familiar from the Appendix J controls, at least in these two families. But a lot of those were also really program management based, and so we wanted to provide more than that. So we also integrated privacy throughout existing controls. One example, in the SI family, System and Information Integrity family, we actually added a control about information disposal. Other controls you'll see we added just another part that's more privacy specific. Here there's a sensor capability and data control, and we added an enhancement about collection minimization. Yep, so keep an eye out for that. It'll hopefully be out really soon. And for the other documents in the roadmap that we hope to be working on. We actually just held a workshop a couple weeks ago, early June, talking about risk assessments and what sort of tools and guidance organizations are looking for next to help them most effectively do privacy risk management. So right now we're sorting through all the results we got from that great workshop and figuring out what the next steps are. So thank you for your time. I'm going to pass it on now to Paul Grassi, Standards and Tech Lead for Trusted Identities Group.
Sitting all the way over. Good morning. As Ellen mentioned, I'm with the Trusted Identities Group. We are inextricably linked to privacy engineering and everything that we do, and I wanted to spend a couple minutes and quickly get to questions because a lot of these slides may be repetitive for those that have been following our efforts with 863. So I'll quickly go through this so we can get to questions and you can get to Ellen, especially since I was booed when she introduced me. And I think because this is common in government, we can have the bouncer remove this guy from the room, right? All right. There's two things that we're doing. The first one is this building block. This has been a long time coming. We've been spending a lot of times in U.S. government looking at federated shared services, and we had a pretty decent approach where we were able to manage to some extent the dissociability that Ellen was referencing in terms of users accessing government services from various commercial credential providers. But we didn't get it all the way there. Attributes were leaking, if you will, by design, not in an insecure or poor designed way, through the provider of this service. So there was a middleman, if you will, that had extreme power in the system, especially if it was compromised. So we put out this building block. It started out as privacy enhanced identity broker. That's an old screenshot. We renamed it actually after the public comment. We got some great comments from the private sector saying, "Why are you forcing us into a single architecture called a broker?" And we're like, "Yep, that makes perfect sense." So we backed completely out of the broker. But this is the first and only building block, I think. Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, or Ellen, where we not only looked at the CIA objectives to set requirements, but we also looked at the three privacy objectives: manageability, disassociability, and predictability that Ellen mentioned. And we have use cases and requirements built around that. I won't read those to you. I think there's probably a slide. Nope. We do have others. I think we actually made manageability NA. Yeah. Because that was more of a requirement for the identity providers and the relying parties, and we're focused on the infrastructure that would bring them together to handle the privacy requirements. So this has been backburnered a little bit for those that have been paying attention, but we're actually spinning it back up now that 63 is sort of coming to a close. So we already have a partner. I think it's a little too early to name them just because we don't have signed paperwork yet. But we've got one partner, but we're still actively looking for others. So for those that are interested, that think that they've got something to offer around identity, federation, privacy, or even being a credential provider or a real relying party, that would be something that we're very interested in. It's one thing to have this thing up and running in a demo with mocked up relying parties and identity providers, but it's much more valuable if we can actually bring real organizations to the table and have them deploy this environment. So 863 is the other area of significant privacy focus. Like I said, everything we do has that privacy perspective, but one of the areas that we've really put it into action and are very proud of is in 863. So I'm not going to spend time talking about the whole of 63. I'll hone in on what I think are some of the cooler privacy things we've done. And first and foremost is we actually created normative requirements. The whole document kind of got a normative remodel and facelift so that our organizations that are required to implement this can find their requirements pretty easily. So we added normative privacy requirements as well. So lots of shalls, mostly shoulds, because we can't force privacy requirements because of the assessment that needs to get done. Every agency's risk will be different, so we've got a lot of shoulds in there. But nonetheless, privacy requirements just the same. And one of the areas that we're really excited about is that we're actually codifying in 63 that you have to do a privacy risk assessment just to get out of the gate. So you're going to be doing these assessments to determine the privacy controls deployed in technology that you'll have to implement. And of course, that's married with all of the other risk-based requirements we have in there as well. We're not saying only do privacy. We still have the typical risk management. So we're staying consistent with what their team is trying to do in terms of folding this into a broader risk-based program. What are some of the cooler requirements? This is an older executive order. The key phrase here that this thing said is effective identity proofing. And it says if there's personal information being made available, so you can log in, gain access to your personal information or someone else's through that authenticated session. You had to do multi-factor authentication, and you have to do effective identity proofing. That term was chosen very specifically because we've actually believed that effective identity proofing could be none at all in this context, or it could be, at the rigor that you would expect of some of these more highly sensitive applications. So this is one example where we think you've got very, very serious and sensitive personal information. In fact, personal health records being stored online, where the agency doesn't need to know your identity, and that is quote unquote effective per that executive order. And in 863, we actually use this as an example and make that call out that says effective identity proofing could equal none. In this fictitious example, let's actually use CMS as our host agency. They're putting up some application that sucks in a lot of data from your wearables, what have you. In the old days, what agencies would likely do is assess at either level of assurance 3, which means significant confidence in the identity that's being presented. So in that case, they would proof them pretty significantly, and they would require them to have some sort of multi-factor authenticator. Or they would do the opposite, which is, this is a nice little service we're offering, but we don't really need to know the identity of the person to provide them this benefit. So let's do LOA 1, which would be single factor, password, whatever. Both of those are bad. The first one's bad because, actually, let me do the second one. The second one's bad because this is personal data. So level 1, single factor is absolutely not appropriate. We would need multi-factor in here to meet the executive order. It's personal data that's retrievable in subsequent sessions. That's something we've made very specific in 863 that's, I don't think, ever been done before or explicitly said, which is self-asserted data also is personal data. So just because it's not validated and verified doesn't mean it's not the right data. If I want a benefit that is based on giving my zip code, as a good citizen that wants that benefit, I'm going to give you my zip code. So don't think just because it's self-asserted that it's not correct. So self-asserted, level 1 level data needs to be protected with multi-factor. The first example is absolutely inappropriate as well, because what we're looking at here is now tying personal health information back to an actual real-life subject, which, again, in the context of this app, where I'm just trying to maybe help people lose weight or giving them some sort of fitness plan, is completely inappropriate. And then when you look at the context of this type of application in the risk posture of CMS, CMS offers healthcare.gov. Does healthcare.gov want to know what your heartbeat is? Do those insurers want to know that? They probably do. Do you want them to know it? No. So having that information tied to an individual would be completely inappropriate for CMS to do. So our new model allows folks to separate it. Don't proof, but give them a strong credential. So this is what I talked about earlier, some of the impact to authenticators. IAL1, which is no proofing, self-asserted, without PII, go ahead and do single factor. We're fine with that. IAL1 with PII, self-asserted or not, is you're required to do multi-factor. So that's why you've got the no's down that AAL1 column. Again, privacy is throughout the suite, but the -C volume, the federation volume, is where we really had some fun. And I think some of our best requirements are. -A is proofing, so we had the notion of collect minimal to proof, only use it for proofing, blah, blah, blah. Standard stuff there. B, very little other than credential leakage. B is just all about authenticators, which really should have no identity tied to them. But C, federation, where this stuff is being collected potentially in one place and sent all over the place, is where we spend a lot of time. So first and foremost, we spent a significant amount of time talking about pseudonymity. And federation is, I think, one of the easiest ways to provide that. Again, that notion of, you may need to know you have a verified person on the other end of the screen. You may want to know that they've got a verified attribute of zip code, but you don't need to know who the heck that person is. And Federation gives us a quick path to that. So, like, we couldn't make them requirements. Like I said, pseudonymity may not make sense in certain use cases, so we couldn't globally force it. But a significant focus on that with some strong language encouraging its use where possible, to include some, I don't have them here, but include some kind of functional choose your own adventures that really drive people into this thought process of, do I need this data? And if I do, can it be pseudonymous? And with that, this is probably one of my favorite. We actually added some hard requirements around this notion of attribute references versus values. References or values being what you would expect, full date of birth, full address, and references being a part of that. So do I need to know full birth date, or do I just need to know over 18? Do I need to know zip code, or do I just need to know in congressional district X? So what we've done to kind of push the envelope here is our CSPs, which are the ones that are managing the identity data and doing the federated assertions, they have to support APIs that do both. So I want full date of birth, or I want some Boolean response to a question about date of birth. Is older than, born in, whatever. And then our relying parties should request them. That should say should request references. That's my fault. Claims was the old term, but that's too overloaded. So we went with references. And if anybody's got a suggestion on something better, I'm all ears. But our RPs should request them.
It's done. We're not editing that anymore. References.
In Rev 4, we'll think about updating references to something else. And RP should request them. And again, that's our recognition that agencies may have a legitimate reason to know your full date of birth rather than older than. So that's just a few of the things that we've done. I think this likely goes for the privacy engineering group, hopefully over time. But a little bit of a plug for how we're going to move forward with working with industry. You've probably seen a lot of the GitHub stuff over the past year. That's going to remain. Now that we're at the tail end, we've decided that this pilot is over and we are now going into production. And TIG will be going forth with GitHub and everything that we do. At least if my name's on it, it will be that way. And then we want to shift into the more typical private sector-based approach to building standards. Implementer drafts, so we don't go final until this thing's been implemented. That would be nice. Need a little bit of support from OMB there, Office of Management and Budget, but that's what we want to do. And then some methodology to get regular updates out to the population, out to our stakeholders, instead of sitting here and saying, oh great, now I need to change references back to claims. I got to go into a year-long SP update cycle. We can do some sort of real ad hoc update very, very quickly without kicking off some formal set of processes. And then for what it's worth for this group, the more international alignment, the better. Our next volume will actually be focused on international alignment. I think the countries that we work with all agree that one less of these documents per country would be nice. So that's going to be our focus here, is to stop doing things that are special to USG and look globally. So that's it. I think we've got a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, and I'll just add that if anyone wants a copy of the deck or wants a copy of the worksheets I talked about earlier, feel free to reach out to us and we can get you those documents.
I say questions over you, so you can stay there.
Any questions? Yes.
So I have quite a lot of experience with E3 implementing the Affordable Health Care Act at the state level. So going forward, as you add in the privacy kind of guidance and overview back to 53, are those going to be should-haves with must-haves in the enhancements, or are they going to be must-haves in the base requirements? How are you guys going to either encourage or enforce the risk at the 53 level?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we're still working out the details, but it will clarify in some way what are legally required, what are more discretionary depending on your context, and what are totally optional requirements.
So further implementation requirements will say whether it's going to be a basic requirement or an advanced requirement based on usage, or, I mean, how do you see like something like CMS or IRS, are they going to give like advanced requirements that say the privacy must be done, or how do you guys see that working with the different government?
For 53? I mean, so yeah, that is something we're talking a lot about is the baseline requirements and then the enhancements and how exactly we're spelling that out. And I will just say that the document will clearly explain that approach. We are still working out the details, but we do know that we need to clarify if it's legally required, if it's based on your context, or if it's up to you, and it's not necessarily based on the baseline requirements, which are focused on CIA, which aren't necessarily applicable to these, right? Yeah. Mhm. And if you have any questions once it's out, feel free to ask me.
Or send comments.
Yeah, or submit comments, even better. Yes?
A lot of this, it seems to me, focuses on interdepartment communications. When it comes to the private sector, do you have any recommendations for user management set or
Oh.
So that's basically what the user is able to deny.
Yeah. We don't have any recommendations, pro or con. I mean, certainly we're advocates of UMA, given where it's being built and what it's based on, being OAuth. We do have plans to look at API level security where potentially that user-based authorization of sharing their attributes and using their attributes could come into play. I don't know if that's necessarily the right place, but that's where we'll probably start talking about it in more detail. We're actively profiling more modern-based protocols now, so we're going to implementers draft with an OAuth and OpenID Connect profile. It's only natural we would potentially move down to UMA. Definitely on our radar and maybe penciled into the roadmap, but nothing firm yet.
Great. Thanks, everyone.